All right, so this is the lesson for Friday, December 4th, and we're going to move on to absolute dating, which is another way that we can tell the age of rocks. And so yesterday we were talking about the relative age of rocks, and the reason why it was called relative is because it's always being compared to one rock and another rock, or one layer and one layer. So it's just putting them in order, and it's not really telling exact ages. And so this is a way of getting an exact age. And it's pretty fascinating. So today what you're going to do is follow along through this PowerPoint. You can take a few notes, just like on this slide. What is absolute dating? You're going to be writing down the difference, so that you can see the difference between relative and absolute. The specifics you don't need to write notes down. It's very technical and chemical reactions and things like that. But just try to get the general idea of what scientists are doing. Okay, so we're going to start that. Before we get going, if you haven't done your attendance, please go do your attendance. We had more people yesterday that did not do their attendance, so it really helps out the school district, and it helps our school not be hounded by the attendance police. So go take attendance, and then you can get back on here. Okay, so here we go. Absolute dating. It's identifying that exact age of the rock, and they use radioactive decay to determine the age of the rock. So we're going to just review a little bit about atoms. This is some of the stuff we covered last year. Subatomic particles of an atom. Remember, atoms have protons, electrons, and neutrons. And which subatomic particles make up the mass of an atom? Well, remember that it was the protons and the neutrons. All right, radioactive decay. This is the stuff that gets kind of crazy, so just try to understand a little bit about this. We have isotopes. And atoms of the same element can have different numbers of neutrons, and the different possible versions of each element are called isotopes. So if you look at the lithium up there, 6 and 3, 7 and 3, 8 and 3, they change, and so those are isotopes. Okay, carbon dating. So this is one of the ways that they can get an exact age on rocks. This is called carbon dating. And what happens is we have carbon-14 in our bodies, and we have carbon-12 in our bodies. Okay? And they use a formula to figure out, you'll see later in the video, how they figure it out. Okay, so if you look at the video, or the picture here, we have carbon in the atmosphere, and nitrogen is out there floating around too, and so carbon will pick up a couple more of the nitrogen and end up with C14 instead of C12, and we have that in us all the time. Okay, so carbon-12 and carbon-14, the amount we have in us is the same as what's in the environment. Okay, so when an organism dies, the clock starts as the carbon-14 decays, changing the ratio. So we're going to watch this video. So I'm going to push play, and you're just going to watch this video. We'll just watch it together.
Hey there, and welcome to Brain Stuff. I'm Josh Clark, and this is the Brain Stuff where I explain to you how carbon-14 dating works. Carbon-14 dating, which we also just call carbon dating, is a form of radiometric dating. And all it is measuring the decay of a certain type of atom found in a once living organism to determine when it was last alive. And all of this starts in the upper atmosphere of Earth, where it's constantly bombarded by cosmic rays. And one of the things these cosmic rays do is knock neutrons off of some atoms and protons off of others. And before you know it, the nice, stable, family man, nitrogen-14 atom is all wrapped up and gone crazy and becomes what's known as a carbon-14 atom, which is radioactive. Now, carbon-14 atoms aren't the only ones in the upper atmosphere. There's also carbon-12 atoms. Carbon-12 atoms are in much more abundance, and they're pretty stable. Carbon-14 atoms are, again, radioactive and unstable, but they're formed at a reliable, steady rate. So at any point in time, we have a pretty good idea of the ratio of carbon-12 atoms to carbon-14 atoms. Got that? It's important. Now, carbon dioxide is essential to life here on Earth. Plants breathe it in, animals eat the plants, we eat the animals and the plants. And these carbon molecules, carbon-14 and 12, that make up the carbon dioxide, get in everything. What's neat is that the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 found in all these living things here on Earth is pretty much the same as what's in the atmosphere, which means it's predictable. And some very, very smart scientists have figured out that carbon-14 actually decays at a predictable rate, right? Carbon-14, like all radioactive particles, has what's called a half-life. Now, the half-life is the amount of time it takes for the number of radioactive particles in a sample to decrease by half. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. That means that after 5,730 years, the amount of carbon-14 atoms in a, say, plant that you found fossilized will be half of what it was the last time that plant took, well, a breath of life. After 11,460 years, which is 2 half-lives, there'll be a quarter the amount of carbon-14 that was originally present. And then after 17,190 years, you'll have just an eighth of the number of carbon-14, and so on until there's none left. And this is actually one of the limitations of carbon-14 dating, that eventually you're going to go far enough back in time that all of the carbon-14 atoms have decayed. And you don't know whether this took place a day before or 100,000 years before, which means the time limit that you can date things using carbon-14 is roughly 50,000 years. But as long as you are trying to date something that lived on Earth within the last 50,000 years, you can figure out roughly when it was last alive. And the way that you do that is by measuring the rate of decay of carbon-14 atoms compared to the slow and steady carbon-12 atoms that are also present in there. Presto, changeo, you've got some carbon-14 dating, and all of a sudden you say, oh my God, this wooden axe handle is 12,000 years old. Pretty sweet stuff. And this whole thing gets even more interesting when you realize that future archaeologists are going to have a lot of trouble using carbon-14 dating thanks to us, humans of the present time. Our industrial activities have been pumping CO2 into the atmosphere and really messing with the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14. And even more astounding, all of the nuclear bombs that we set off in the mid-20th century, well, those mess with the atmospheric ratios too. So good luck with all that, future anthropologists and archaeologists. Sorry.
Okay, so here's the process that they go through for this carbon-14 dating. You can see that they find something in the ground, so let's say a bone. They clean it and they take a sample, and then they dry it and take it through a series of chemical reactions, and then they put it in a spectrometer, and through that they can read on the computer the date of the sample. So that is really crazy that it goes from a piece of a bone crushed and then shot through a spectrometer, and then it converts it to data. That's really heady stuff. So we're going to see an example of that here coming up. Okay, so that guy was talking about half-lives, okay? And the half-life is the amount of time necessary for half of the nuclei in the sample to decay to its stable isotope. Okay, so you'll see in the video how they figure that out. Okay. So one of the things that happens is carbon-14 dating can only take us back about 50,000 years. So anything that's older than that, you can't use this type of dating. You have to use something else. And that would bring us to radioactive decay. So radioactive decay will decay until it is stable. Okay, so uranium-238 will decay over time to form lead. It just breaks down and becomes lead. Okay, very long time. Okay, so we're going to watch a video about that, and they are going to show how they actually do this, and it's pretty cool to see it in the lab. So anyway, if you have been listening this whole time and paying attention, I really appreciate it. If you would like to get a raffle ticket, just send me an email or a text and let me know your favorite drink, your favorite beverage. All right, let's watch the video.
We study the rocks of the Earth's crust to work out how the crust formed over time and what implications that has for making sedimentary basins, for having faults and earthquakes. And we've got a rock here that may be an important part of that story.
So when we go into the field, we like to take samples of the rocks in order so that we can take them back to the lab and look at them in further detail. So when we do this, we need to make sure that the rock type that we get is nice and fresh and not altered or weathered in any way. And then we write down in our notebooks and on the sample itself, we label it and we give it a GPS location and mark it down on the map so we know exactly where we've sampled that rock from.
And we can see that it's made up of many little minerals. So what we have to do here is we need to look for a mineral called zircon. It's a very small mineral, much smaller than most of these minerals, but it's almost certainly here in very small amounts as very small crystals. So the great value of zircon is that it contains uranium, and that uranium decays according to the half-life of the radioactive decay to lead. If we can measure the amount of uranium and the amount of lead, we can work out the age of that rock, the time it crystallized. At the time that this rock formed and the zircon crystals crystallized, this rock was a magma. It was a molten magma deep in the earth, maybe 10 kilometers down. So the dating of this zircon crystal is telling us when the magma crystallized deep in the earth's crust.
So this rock, it's just come straight from the field. We want the zircon grains out of this rock, and the way to do that is to crush it.
So once we have crushed our rock, we can then separate out the zircons from those heavy minerals by using the Franz magnetic separator, where we pass that mineral fraction, they pass down a chute and they're vibrated, they pass across the magnet, and the magnetic minerals are separated out on one side and the zircons are separated out on the other side. So once we've separated the zircons from the magnetic minerals, we then use a microscope. So on the screen here we've got a blown up image of the zircon crystals. On the right here is a piece of pencil lead, so the length here that we can see exposed is about 1 millimetre. And so you can see just how tiny these little zircon crystals are. But all of them generally have nice, well-formed crystal edges and nice pointy tips to them, and these are what we target when we analyse for uranium lead dating. So from here we will pick around about 100 zircon crystals individually, and we will take those over to our laser ablation machine. We take them over to the mass spectrometer where we zap that with a laser beam, and it takes off a little bit of the zircon, and then we can measure the amount of uranium and the amount of lead isotopes that's within that zircon. And based on the ratio between uranium and lead that we've just analysed, we can therefore work out the exact age at which that crystal crystallised within a magma. The ratio between the uranium and the lead is all based on the principle of radioactive decay. Well, when that zircon crystallises, it contains 100% uranium and basically no lead. And over a certain period of time, that uranium starts to decay radioactively, and it produces lead isotopes, which start increasing. Over time, we gain more and more lead and less uranium, So in a zircon, if we've got lots of uranium and very little lead, we know it's quite a young rock. And if we've got very little uranium and lots of lead, then we know it's relatively a much older rock. Once we've measured our uranium and lead ratio, we can work out basically where we fit on this curve and how old our rock sample is. And for uranium, we've got two isotopes of uranium, uranium-235, which has a half-life of 700 billion years, and then the other uranium isotope that we measure is uranium-238. One half-life that takes 4.5 billion years. Because this has such a long half-life, we can date really, really old rocks using the uranium lead method.
Okay, so yeah, that was a lot to take in. But yeah, the uranium is got such a long half-life that they can keep going back and back and back and find that ratio on that graph, which was pretty interesting to watch them take that rock and break it down into all these little pieces and then have a laser go through it to get the data on the computer, which is amazing. So that's all for the slideshow. The next thing that you're going to do is on the list of assignments today, there's going to be a video and a recipe for making your own fossils. So what we would like you to do is get those ingredients. They're really simple. It's just flour and salt, I believe, and a little bit of water. And you are just going to mix that together and press it out. And you're just going to follow the recipe and then find some things around the house that would make a cool impression. So we made this today. We just rolled some keys into it. We also had a bracelet that we could roll into the clay, and it made some really cool impressions. And so you're just going to follow the instructions and find some things around the house that would make some really cool impressions. And this is basically what they find out in nature. So follow that recipe, and we're going to be sharing these on Monday and Thursday of next week. So raffle tickets to those who have something to share and some cool impressions. All right, have a good weekend.